a lovely, lovely afternoon. I'm sitting here in Manhattan. I am wearing a tie. I have a painting behind me, a totally real painting behind me. The totally real painting even has a remote control to make sure it doesn't turn off. That's how totally real it is. I have got plenty of unnamed diet beverage. I have got plenty of unnamed water beverage with ice. I was a couple minutes behind, and I don't like being late, but that's okay. I'm here with all of you, and we are going to have a lovely afternoon conversation. So be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell so that you get notified the next time we have one of our lovely chats in the afternoon, morning, evening, or night. And as always, if you can post this around, if you can put this on Reddit, put this on Twitter, put this on Facebook, put this on the Instagrams, you know, I don't know. I'm only 33 years old. I feel like an old man. I remember when Facebook first got started, all the old people thought that Facebook and MySpace were the same thing. And the older people would say, "Are you on the MyFace? Are you on the MyFace? Are you on one of the My Faces?" And we would roll our eyes and be like, "There's MySpace and there's Facebook, you old man." And we would roll our eyes. Those were the days, huh? When Facebook was brand new. I remember when you had to have a college, you had to have a .edu in order to get a Facebook account. That's how old I am. I'm only 33, but I remember when I was 19, when I got my first Facebook account, you had to have a .edu in order to get a Facebook account. Isn't that wild? But anyway, folks, I could ramble about that kind of thing all day. I could just ramble about that kind of thing all day, but I'm on here to have a serious political conversation on this lovely afternoon. So be sure to hit the like button, be sure to hit the subscribe button, be sure to hit the notifications bell. If you are new, you are not sick of hearing this yet, but if you are not new, you've heard this a million times, but I have to say it for those who are new. The way we do the show is like this. I give my opening remarks. The whole time I'm writing your super chat questions down with this lovely pen. And then we do our roll call, where we find out who the audience is. I call you out as I see you, names and locations, writing the super chat questions down. And then from there, I answer the super chat questions for the second half of the show, and then we are done. That's how the show works. It's a three-parter. The middle part, the roll call doesn't usually take that long, but it's a three-part show. Opening remarks, roll call, and answering super chat questions. That's how we do the show. And I usually just go until I run out of super chat questions or I have to stop for some other reason. And so the second half of the show is made by your super chats. If you have a question you want to ask me, send me a super chat and I will answer it. I will write it down with this pen and I will answer the questions in the order they were asked. Now, linked below is an important web conference that is happening this Saturday called Cancel This Webinar. And it's going to be amazing. It is going to be the best web conference. It's going to be amazing, right? It will be hosted by good friend of the program, Dust James. Updates on March. Dust James. Rural, urban divide. Dust James, it will feature Dan Kovalik talking about his new book on cancel culture. It will feature the comedy and political insights of Mr. Peter Coffin. It will also feature the music of David Rovics, the anarchist folk musician. It is going to be an amazing web conference, so I hope you don't miss it. Link is below. It'll be this Saturday, so be sure to tune in. That is an important announcement I wanted to make. Link is below. Don't miss it. You won't regret it. Join and tune in to Cancel This Web Conference. It's going to be awesome. It'll be on this channel. So there you go. I wanted to make that announcement. I wrote down 2 super chats already. They're already on the list. See that? I wrote them down. And if you send another super chat, I'll write it down. And then in the second half of the show, we answer the super chat questions. That's how we roll here, right? Opening the unnamed diet beverage. It always sounds like I'm cocking a gun. Listen to this. Doesn't that sound like I'm cocking a gun? I mean, it's like I'm caulking a shotgun or something, but I'm just opening a can of unnamed diet beverage. But yes, I'm pouring it into the cup with ice. It's pouring in. I'm pouring it slowly so the fizz doesn't boil up. And there we go. There we go. So I guess without any further ado, we will jump into the opening remarks. Folks, I want to sincerely apologize. Lukashenko. I want to sincerely apologize for starting 2 minutes late. Sometimes these things happen. They are unavoidable. A lot of people who start their web conferences make a point of actually starting them late. They launch them at a certain time and they wait like 20 minutes for the audience to build up before they begin. I don't do that. I don't do that because my time is valuable and so is your time. And I consider starting meetings and events on time to be a distinct difference between a proletarian organization and a petty bourgeois organization. Working class people, their time is very valuable. Folks, I will never forget, when I was living in New York City, I lived very far from home, and I was working full-time at an insurance firm. And this was the height of Occupy Wall Street. It was the first year I lived in New York City. I worked full-time at an insurance firm, and I was a member of a communist group. Most of the members of the communist group were retired, unemployed, whatever. And I would go to the office, and the meetings would start at 7, right? And, I had just worked an 8-hour day. I mean, it was actually a 9-hour day if you counted my lunch break. So it was, I just worked all day. I had gone from Brooklyn to Manhattan, where my meeting was taking place. And I got there right at 7 to start the meeting at 7 o'clock. And I knew I was going to run out of there as fast as I could when the meeting was over. The reason for that being that I then would have to go home and do my laundry or take care of whatever I needed to do so I could get to sleep, so I could wake up again and get to the office and do it all over again. Right? So, they would have this meeting at 7 o'clock on Monday nights, and I would get there at 7 o'clock. And it was the most frustrating thing in the world to sit there and wait for the meeting to start at 7:45. As these retired folks came in, as these people that were full-time activists or whatever, moseyed on in. And it was just the most painful thing. Why? Because I, being a working person, was working full-time in order to pay my bills in New York City. My time was valuable. Now, for college students, it's certainly not the same thing. For college students, they might work a job on the side or whatever, but they're mainly focused on school, and their time is not as regimented, right? And the same goes for retired folks. They're retired, right? The same goes for people that are unemployed. But if you're building an organization of proletarians, Weimar, enter left. You're building an organization of proletarians. It is important that you start the meeting on time. And I must say, one of the most proletarian organizations in America, and you aren't going to want to hear this. I'm not talking about the message. I'm not talking about the ideology. I'm just talking about the content. I'm talking about the membership. The most proletarian organizations in the United States are churches. Churches. I don't care what denomination. Churches are proletarian overwhelmingly, right? Churches are made up of working people. And you'll notice that churches tend to start events on time in the United States, right? If you are a Presbyterian or a Methodist or a Baptist or whatever, church service starts at 10 o'clock, rarely is it 10:10 by the time that organ starts playing or the church service begins, because the time of all those people is valuable, right? If there is a there's an evening Bible study class and it starts at 7 o'clock, rarely will you see it start at any later than 7:10 or 7:15. Why? Because it's made up of proletarians, right? And that building a proletarian organization is very different than building an organization of petty bourgeois folks, an organization of students, an organization of the lumpen proletariat. It's a very, very different kind of thing, right? You'll notice that proletarian organizations, people tend to dress nice. They tend to dress professionally. And the whole thing that I kind of constantly am drumming, this whole drumbeat that I have been drumming on, is this notion that we need to get out of the movement and get to the masses. And what that means is that we need to stop acting like lumpen, like we're trying to build a lumpen counter gang. Stop acting like we are trying to build a petty bourgeois intellectuals club, and more start acting like we are trying to build a proletarian organization, an organization made up of the broad masses of people organizing and working in their own interests. We need to develop a proletarian outlook as an organization, and part of that means starting our meetings on time. Part of that means wearing professional clothes like suits, suit socialism. Part of that means not having an outlook that favors chaos. Part of that means not viewing average Americans as the enemy. Part of that means being able to have a coherent ideological program, a clear ideological program and message. All of this is essential. Getting out of the movement and getting to the masses is not simply a matter of handing our leaflets to different people. It's about changing our complete orientation. That is what we're trying to do. We are trying to become a group of worker politicians, working class people who are entering the political process in our own interest, right? That is what a proletarian Marxist organization should be. It should be an organization of worker politicians, working people entering the political process in their own interest, to put forward their own program. That is what we are trying to do, and that means orienting ourselves completely differently. There is a pamphlet by Karl Marx that has an awful name. I don't think it was awful at the time Karl Marx named it, but because it has this name, I avoided reading it for many years because I had no idea what the hell the name meant, and so of course I did not bother to read the pamphlet. It's one of Karl Marx's most important pamphlets, and it has an awful name. The name is The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And whenever I would see that pamphlet on a literature table or anything, I would think, I'm not interested in that. What the hell is a Brumaire? Who the hell is Louis Bonaparte? I would see that pamphlet and I would think that pamphlet was worthless. I just had no interest in reading a pamphlet that I knew what 18 was, that was a number, didn't know what Brumaire was, didn't know who Louis Bonaparte is, so, 3 of the 4 words on the cover of the book, I didn't know anything about. So, based on, 3 of the 4 words in the title of the book being something I knew nothing about, I didn't ever read this pamphlet. But as Donald Trump was getting elected, as I began to intensely study the concept of a division in the capitalist class between one faction and another faction, I read The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby, a very important text about divisions in the American ruling class. I saw Donald Trump representing one faction of the ruling class fighting against another faction. I forced myself to read The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And that pamphlet is vitally important to understanding what happens in a capitalist crisis, and it is vitally important in understanding the difference between a proletarian revolution and a Bonapartist coup and factional struggles in the ruling class. And it is key and important in understanding the role of the lumpen proletariat. The lumpen proletariat, right? And it's key in understanding what is wrong with the American left and why we're here. It's a vitally important pamphlet. It is not very long, and honestly, it's a little hard to get through because we're not living in France in 1851. But Karl Marx was living in France in 1851, and he saw the parliament being overthrown, and Napoleon's nephew declaring himself to be the military dictator. And he analyzed it as a Marxist would. He understood the class forces involved. He understood this wasn't a workers' revolution. He understood what was causing all of this. And so he wrote this very important pamphlet analyzing it. And because we're not in the context of 1851 Paris, we lose a lot of the references. And it's very, very hard to get through. And you have to do background research if you're going to read the pamphlet. You almost feel like you're decoding it. But if you can decode Karl Marx's vitally important pamphlet, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, you can understand a lot of very important key lessons. You can understand why I'm always beating this drum. Out of the movement and to the masses. Out of the movement and to the masses. Because in order to establish his military dictatorship, Louis Bonaparte built a lumpen army. He built a lumpen army, an army of literati. What are literati? Literati are educated people who are very interested in literature, college professors, intellectuals, literati. He built an army of pimps and prostitution solicitors. He built an army of knife grinders. He built an army of roués. That refers to men that are obsessed with sex, roués. He built an army of all kinds of criminal elements in French society, criminal elements, intellectuals. Karl Marx referred to it as the whole mess that they call La Bohème. And he built this army of lumpen elements in order to push forward the agenda of his faction of the ruling class, right? And to beat back the factory owners and stabilize French society with some capitalist reforms, right? And, and that's what he did. And Marx distinguishes between the Society of December 10th, which is what Louis Bonaparte formed, this Bonapartist counter gang, this lumpen counter gang that Louis Bonaparte built to force his will on French society. He distinguishes between that and the laboring nation, right? The broad masses of French people who are the working class, who the intention of Louis Bonaparte was to calm down and hold off in the struggle. So, as we're wrangling with the question is, how do we get to the masses? How do we not build a lumpen counter gang to serve one section of the ruling class or another? How do we instead build a proletarian organization? Things that seem trivial, like what kind of clothes we wear. Things that seem trivial, like what time we start the meetings, become very important, right? Become very, very, very important, I can remember how frustrated I was when I would come from the insurance company out in Brooklyn all the way to Manhattan, right, to sit in an office for a meeting that's supposed to start at 7 and wait for it to start at 7:45 when I knew I had to go home and do my laundry and I had to get to sleep because I was going to be up again the next morning at 6 to get to work on time. And I might add that I didn't have any children. I was not married at that time, right? Imagine if I'd had responsibilities, right? And that part of this is figuring out the structure of building a proletarian organization. Look, one aspect of a proletarian organization is expecting people to pay for things, right? And I know that's not something that people want to hear, right? We're used to getting things for free, right? And especially those of us who are activists. Right? If you've ever gone to, Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter, you're used to getting stuff for free, right? You're used to there being free food that's distributed. You're used to, and again, right? That's because these are mobilizations to serve one faction of the ruling class and its fight against another. But in a proletarian organization, everyone is expected to pull their weight. And for years, I used to give away communist newspapers. I was in a communist group that we just gave our newspaper away. Our communist newspaper, we gave it away for free. We just gave it away for free. And you know what? We would always see it on the ground, and we would always see it in the garbage. Why? Why? Because when you give somebody something for free, they think it's junk mail, and they don't take it seriously. But there were other communist groups that sold their newspaper for $1 or $2 sometimes, and you know what? You never saw those newspapers on the ground, because when people pay for something, when they invest in it, they value it more. And by giving our newspaper away for free, we were subconsciously telling people that our newspaper was junk mail. We were sending the message that this is what our newspaper is worth. But by charging $1 for a newspaper, you are communicating to people that it's worth your time, and you're only giving it to people who actually are, feel like giving you $1 for it, right? The people who buy it are only people who will be interested in reading it, right? And again, giving $1 for a communist newspaper is far more proletarian than giving it out for free, right? Go to Times Square, a few blocks from here, they got a place called Times Square. And even amid the pandemic, it's full of people handing out shit for free. Every time you go into Times Square, there's people handing out leaflets and it's ads for nail salons and deals for Broadway shows, or there's all kinds of people. And do I ever read any of this stuff that people just give me for free? No, it's junk mail, right? Every day I open my mailbox and there's 5 or 6 junk mail things, and they go straight to the garbage. Right? But if I were to pay for something, right, it's a different kind of thing. And this is more of the proletarian outlook. It's more of the proletarian outlook. So I just wanted to share that. And I don't know why I decided to, because I was 2 minutes late starting my stream, go on this long ramble about why it's proletarian to start, events on time. But I feel like this is, this is not what people want to hear. This is not what people want to hear. This is not what people want to hear. I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear. I am here to tell you what you need to hear, right? Go back and listen to some of Malcolm X's best speeches, and you will hear Malcolm X say, I know you don't want to hear this, but that is a sign that Malcolm X is not a grifter. That is a sign that Malcolm X is serious, right? Someone who is trying to con you and manipulate you will only tell you what you want to hear. But somebody who cares about you, somebody who's your friend, somebody who really has good intentions and wishes you well, will sometimes tell you things that you do not want to hear. And that is the difference between a communist revolutionary and a grifter. A grifter will only say things that their audience wants to hear. Right? If I were a grifter, I would be sitting here with a microphone going, oh my God, those bleeping Republicans, they get bleeping money from bleeping corporations. They're a bunch of bleeping. I mean, we've all seen, there's many podcasts and videos from people that just sit there and curse up a storm about how much we hate Republicans, and Republicans are a bunch of bleeping. And they don't take any risks. They don't take any stands that are controversial. They definitely don't go against U.S. foreign policy. And at the end of the day, they're just in it to, collect advertising revenue. Well, I'm sorry, but I am here because I fundamentally know that capitalism in the United States is in a crisis. The system of profits in command is not sustainable. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. And the only way we're going to get it is by getting out of the movement and getting to the masses. And that means orienting ourselves differently. That means wearing suits, right? That means starting the meetings on time. That means having a coherent ideological program. And so, as we try to get to the masses, we must reorient ourselves in how we operate. So there you go. That is my opening spiel about that. Now, I got a suggestion, a very good suggestion today. Not sure the person wants to be shouted out to about the suggestion that they made. But someone suggested that I go over, they didn't exactly suggest this, their suggestion was a little bit different, but based on a suggestion I received from somebody about what to talk about in my opening remarks for today, I have decided that I am going to I'm going to, for the remainder of my opening remarks, talk about socialism in the United States of America and the history of socialists and revolutionaries in the USA, right? And just briefly touch on some of the unknown, forgotten history of socialism in America. Because I got to tell you, when I was a kid, when I first heard about communism, learned about it in school, heard about it from family members and stuff, I was constantly told that it doesn't work. You know, communism is everyone gets paid the exact same wage no matter how hard they work, and clearly it doesn't work. And look, the Soviet Union, they tried it and it collapsed, and so and I started getting in the mindset that maybe there might be something good about socialism. I was thinking about this, right? So I remember I got on the internet. The internet was a new thing, and I discovered on the internet that there was a Communist Party of the United States. And when I discovered this, I was shocked because I assumed I was the only person in the world that would still consider communism, because based on everything anyone had ever told me, it never worked, it never had any successes. You know, it was shocking to me. But that shows how effective the propaganda is. The fact that I assumed that I would be the only person in the country that believed in socialism, the fact that I thought that shows how effective the anti-communist propaganda of U.S. society is. Because the reality is that socialism is more American than apple pie. Apple pie was invented in France, and socialism has far more American roots than apple pie does. Socialism is more American than apple pie. Folks, the first person to use the word socialism was a French man named Henry Saint-Simon. But the first person to use the word socialism in English was a guy named Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a Welsh factory owner who determined that the capitalist system was not good, and he built socialist cities and socialist cooperatives. And he eventually moved to Indiana, and he set up a socialist city in Indiana called New Harmony. And New Harmony is now, up to this day, in the conservative state of Indiana, the city of New Harmony is to this day a historical landmark. And Robert Owen was widely loved in the United States, so much so that he was actually invited to give a speech to a joint session of the U.S. Congress about the benefits of socialism. Robert Owen was a utopian socialist, and he built New Harmony. He built New Lanark in Scotland, and then he built New Harmony in Indiana. And he was popular, and the colony of New Harmony, the socialist city that he built, was widely loved. And New Harmony was not the only socialist city or a utopian community in the early United States. You know, I come from a part of Ohio, northeast Ohio, near Akron, Ohio. And in Akron, Ohio, they do have a little museum for a place called Zoar, Z-O-A-R, Zoar. Zoar was a socialist community built in the United States in the 1800s. A group of people in the United States who were opposed to capitalism and wanted to build a utopian community. They built a city called Zoar, right? And again, it's also a historical landmark. You can go to Zoar. And there's many of them. There are many socialist utopian communities. Many of the founding people of the United States, many of the people in the United States who were early settlers of the United States, they did awful things in terms of the Native American population, but many of them also, you know, they decided that they were going to build socialist communities in the United States. Now, the first revolutionary socialist group in the United States was called the Workmen's Party. The Workmen's Party. And it was located in New York City. And it was a political party of people that were inspired and in touch with Karl Marx. They wrote letters back and forth with Karl Marx. They were in New York City. They expanded to other parts of the country. They're called the Workmen's Party. And they tried to unite various labor unions into the National Labor Union, the NLU, the National Labor Union. And, you know, eventually, you know, Karl Marx formed the First International, the International Working Men's Association, the First International. And there were a number of people living in the United States who affiliated to the First International. And on top of that, in 1848, there was the German Revolution. People may not know this, but in 1848, Germany was not a country yet. There was a number of different feudal principalities, in Germany. And there was an uprising of the peasants and the progressives and the Republicans, they were called, demanding the creation of a German nation state, of a republic. There was an uprising that took place all throughout Germany in 1848, and it failed. It was defeated. And Karl Marx was a participant in that uprising. He carried a gun. He was a revolutionary fighter, and so was Friedrich Engels. And the revolution failed, so they had to flee the country, right? And that's why Karl Marx spent his life in exile. He was part of the 1848 German Revolution. And after the German Revolution failed, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Germans who fled to the United States. And in fact, to this day, the most common ethnicity among white Americans is German. The most common last name among Americans is Miller, a German name, Müller, right? What are the two most famous American foods? You have hamburgers. Where's that from? Hamburg, Germany, right? There's no ham in the hamburger. It comes from the city of Hamburg. It's a Hamburg sandwich, right? And hot dogs. And what were hot dogs once known as? Hot dogs were once known as Frankfurters. They were Frankfurt sausages. And in World War I, we decided to start calling them hot dogs, because we didn't want people to think we were German. But until then, they were known as Frankfurters or Frankfurt sausages. So the two most famous American foods are considered to be German. Another very famous American food is coleslaw. Where do you think coleslaw came from, right? And before you go to school, before you start first grade in the United States, what do you go to? You go to kindergarten. Right? Where do you think kindergarten came from, right? The USA is very, very, very German, and that is largely due to the fact that in 1848, when this progressive uprising happened in Germany, in which Karl Marx was a fighter and an armed revolutionary who took part, and it was many different factions in the German Revolution of 1848, many different factions, right? There was the Communist League led by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, but there was also factions that just wanted regular bourgeois democracy. There were religious groups, the Anabaptists, they were called, various groups, and the Mennonites and the Baptists and the Amish and a lot of the religious groups that currently exist in the United States can trace their heritage back to the German Anabaptists that were part of that uprising. It was a big uprising, and many of the first American communists were people who had fled Germany in 1848. And in fact, if you go back to the 1840s and 50s, before the U.S. Civil War, there was actually a stereotype. There was a stereotype associated with German Americans. People thought German Americans were all crazy radicals. That was the stereotype, that German Americans were all communists, because overwhelmingly, the German Americans who came to the United States, the overwhelming majority of them had been revolutionaries. They had been people who fought on the battlefield, demanding the creation of a German nation state, right? They wanted a democratic republic. That was what the uprising was demanding. They didn't want local kings and nobles and principalities. They wanted a democratic nation state. That was the uprising. And let me add, what was the anthem of the 1848 revolution of Germany? Right? What was the anthem, right? You might not like to hear this, right? But what was the anthem of the 1848 German Revolution? Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles, Deutschland, über all das Welt. Now, you can't sing that anymore in Germany. It's illegal because that's considered to be, a Nazi anthem. But back in 1848, Deutschland über alles was progressive because they were fighting for a democratic nation state. Get rid of feudalism. Germany above all else. Germany above all else was a progressive anthem. The 1848 German Revolution, and it failed. And like any revolution, when a revolution fails, that's when the bourgeoisie brings the hammer down. and start oppressing people. In this case, it wasn't the bourgeoisie, it was the feudal aristocracy, brought the hammer down. So if you were on the wrong side of the 1848 German Revolution, you had to flee Germany. Karl Marx fled to London and Paris, right? Richard Wagner, you ever hear of Wagner, right? The Wagner opera, he was part of the German Revolution of 1848. He had to get the hell out of there also. Many German intellectuals, many people from all different strata. You know, Beethoven was an enthusiastic admirer and supporter of the 1848 revolution, if I'm not mistaken. I believe one of Beethoven's best symphonies is the Pastoral Symphony, which has the Shepherd's Song in it. And Beethoven dedicated his Pastoral Symphony to the peasantry of the European heartland, of France, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, places like that. And that Beethoven was very much, you know, an admirer of the peasants of Europe, and said that they would be the ones who made history. So the German Revolution of 1848 failed. One of the people who fought alongside Karl Marx in the German Revolution of 1848 was a guy named August Willich. And August Willich fled to the United States. There was another guy who was part of it, fought alongside Karl Marx. You know, his name was Joseph Wedemeyer. And Joseph Wedemeyer also fled to the United States. And they came to the United States, and they were communists, and they were members of the International Communist, the International Working Men's Association. They had correspondence with Karl Marx. They fought with Karl Marx about things they disagreed with. They were well known. And they moved to Ohio, of all places, right? Ohio was largely settled by Germans. Ohio and Pennsylvania was settled by what they called the Red 48ers, people who fled Germany in 1848, Red 48ers, right? And, you know, they were known as Republicans because they had fought for a republic in Germany. And the most radical of the Republicans, the ones who wanted to create a socialist society, they were called the Red Republicans. So, you know, most of the people, you know, the people who fought in the German Revolution were called the Republicans. They were fighting against the monarchists. That's the German Revolution of 1848. And the Karl Marx faction of the 1848 revolution were known as the Red Republicans. They were not just Republicans, they were Red Republicans. Red in terms of communism. That was their what they were known as, the Red Republicans. And they came to the United States. They were known as the Red 48ers. And it was a stereotype. This is a pattern in American history. When there's an inflow of immigrants from any country, immediately the stereotype of those immigrants becomes that they're a bunch of communist radicals, right? They thought Irish were all a bunch of communist radicals when they first came to the United States. They thought, you know, Jews and people from Eastern Europe were all a bunch of communist radicals when they first came to the United States. Italians, Sacco and Vanzetti in the 1920s, you know, they played up the idea these were foreign-born communists, Sacco and Vanzetti. This is kind of a pattern. But yes, when the Germans were fleeing to the United States in the 1840s and 50s, there was a stereotype that they were communists. And you have to also remember that the biggest, you know, political movement that happened in the United States around this time, 1840s, 1850s, was the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery. Slavery was considered to be an awful, horrendous thing, which it absolutely was. And all throughout New England and all throughout the Midwestern states, there was a feeling that slavery was wrong. You had mass religious revival movements. You had the Second Great Awakening, which my ancestor, Charles Finney, was part of. And you had this huge anti-slavery movement. And the communists and the labor movement, the labor unions that the communists were building, were a big part of the abolitionist movement. Karl Marx famously said, "Labor in white skin cannot be free when labor in black skin is branded," right? And the understanding of the labor union, you know, they were going around to the different labor unions and saying to them, look, labor unions, one of the key things you should fight for is an end to slavery, because it hurts all working people. To be competing with people who have to work for free. Slaves work for free, right? So the labor movement the forces that eventually became the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, those folks were very key in fighting for the abolition of slavery. Now, when the Civil War actually broke out, you had the Civil War, the southern states that seceded from the country. You had, mobilization of the federal government and of this big coalition to defeat the slaveholders. August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer, these two well-known communist German immigrants, they became very heroic in putting down the revolt of the slaveholders. St. Louis, Missouri was the site of battle, and it was communists. It was the communist division. There was an entire communist division of the Union Army during the Civil War. It was known as the Ohio 9th Regiment. The Ohio 9th Regiment, Die Neuner, the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. And it was the communist division. And they marched into battle singing La Marseillaise, the French Revolutionary anthem. And they waved a red flag as their regimental emblem, as their regimental colors was the red flag. And it was a communist German-speaking division of the Union Army. And they spoke German, and they waved a red flag, and they sang the French Revolutionary anthem, and they were the communist division of the Union Army, right? And August Willich rose up to be the rank of a brigadier general in the U.S. Army. So there was actually a brigadier general in the U.S. Army who was a communist, right? Again, they don't teach you any of this, right? Furthermore, during the war, the Republican Party of New York City became very, very radical. New York City, where I'm talking to you from, was a stronghold of pro-slavery sentiments, right? New York City, there was a lot of pro-slavery folks here. Even though this is a northern city, it was very pro-slavery. Why? Wall Street. Wall Street, back then, it was not a stock exchange. Wall Street was an insurance hub. And they made lots of money insuring slave ships, right? Because back then, traveling across the ocean was a lot less safe than it is now. And there was a lot of cotton being picked by the unpaid labor of slaves and being shipped to Britain to run their textile mills. And every so often, one of those ships would sink and the capitalists would lose all their money. So Wall Street began with the hustle of insuring slave ships. Wall Street was heavily involved in the slave trade. And in fact, there was a slave market on Wall Street at one point. Now, later, as the North got rid of slavery, it was only the southern states that had it. But, there was actually a slave market on Wall Street. There's actually a museum of the African burial ground on Wall Street. Wall Street was up to its neck in the slave trade, up to its neck in the British Empire and their global Adam Smith free trade empire. And so in New York City, while most of the capitalists, the industrial factory owners throughout the emerging United States, throughout the North, throughout the Midwest, were anti-slavery because they were for industry and they saw the plantation owners as kind of a rival. New York City, confront racist. New York City was a stronghold of pro-slavery sentiments. A stronghold of pro-slavery sentiments. And because of that, the Republican Party of New York City was very radical. And the leader of the Republican Party was named Horace Greeley. I don't know if people know the name Horace Greeley, but Horace Greeley was the leader of the Republican Party of New York City. And he had a newspaper called the New York Tribune. And Horace Greeley was very anti-slavery. And he was very much an advocate of the right of women to vote. And he was very, very progressive. And he was a socialist. He was not a Marxist, but he was interested in utopian socialism. He'd hung out with Robert Owen and some of the utopian socialists. And he had a slogan, "Go West, young man. Go West, young man." Right? He wanted he wanted the country to develop economically. So in his newspaper, the New York Tribune, he wrote on it, "Go West, young man." And during the Civil War, the London correspondent for the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, was Karl Marx. Karl Marx was actually employed by the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. That's one of the only jobs Karl Marx ever had. Karl Marx had 2 jobs in his life. The first job he had is he worked for the railroads in Britain, and they fired him because his handwriting was too sloppy. So they fired him. That was his first job. And his second job was he was the London correspondent for the New York Tribune, the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. Karl Marx worked for the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. So Karl Marx has 2 jobs in his whole life, and one of them is working for the New York City Republican Party newspaper. How on earth can people think that communism is un-American? It's unpatriotic. It's foreign. How on earth can anyone think that? How on earth can anyone think that, right? That communism is un-American, when one of the only 2 jobs that Karl Marx ever had in his life was to work for the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. One of the fact that the guy who first used the word socialism in the English language lived in Indiana and spent a huge chunk of his life in Indiana. The fact that there was a brigadier general in the Union Army, in Abraham Lincoln's Union Army, there was a brigadier general who was a communist. How can anybody think communism is un-American or unpatriotic? It's contrary to our way of life. How can anyone think that? How can anybody think that? Now, after the Civil War, because the slaveholders were defeated, right? And the other thing you have to remember, Abraham Lincoln was not a communist, but he was a populist, right? Abraham Lincoln was a populist, right? He was from Illinois, and Illinois at that point was the Wild West. It was unsettled territory, right? And Abraham Lincoln was this tall guy from out in Illinois who was a lawyer, who had a reputation for sticking up for the downtrodden, sticking up for the little people and those who were being oppressed, right? He was a lawyer who made a name for himself as being a champion of working people. And he had a career out in Illinois as a populist. And, there's many stories about Abraham Lincoln and Illinois. When he spoke in the legislature, the state legislature of Illinois, he condemned the capitalists. He said the capitalists generally conspire to fleece the people. Abraham Lincoln was also an atheist. And, that was quite an unpopular stand to take in the United States in the 1840s and 1850s. To be an atheist in the United States of America was not a popular stand. But Abraham Lincoln was known. He would go to the church and he would argue with the minister, and he would point to contradictions in the Bible. That was a brave thing to do, right, in Illinois in the 1840s and in a little tiny, unsettled territory. So Abraham Lincoln was this atheist who criticized capitalism in his speeches. He said that labor is superior to capital, that the work, Abraham Lincoln, yes, he was problematic in many ways. He said a lot of racist things throughout his life, and, we don't pretend he's a communist. He was not a communist. But he was deemed to be a progressive and anti-slavery positions. That was his main thing. And when he ran for president, he was very much a populist. Go listen to the campaign song of Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln and Liberty Too. Lincoln and Liberty Too. There was a poem written about Abraham Lincoln. Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness. He was seen as a wild man, a wild working class guy, this tall lawyer who stood up for the common man in court. He was a populist. Abraham Lincoln was a populist, if there ever was such a thing. He came to the White House as a revolutionary, as a guy from Illinois who was in with the labor unions, who stood up to the slaveholders, who had, fought in the courtrooms, for the downtrodden. Abraham Lincoln was seen as a populist and a progressive. And Karl Marx wrote him a letter congratulating him in the 1864 presidential election. And he said that Karl Marx said that Abraham Lincoln was the single-minded son of the working class. And he spoke of Lincoln in glowing terms. Go read the way Karl Marx wrote about Abraham Lincoln. But after the U.S. Civil War, right, there was a period of Reconstruction, where they were redistributing the land very briefly. There was an effort to roll back the horrors of slavery. And there was a radical upsurge in the country, right? After the defeat of slavery, the labor unions got stronger, the progressive movement got stronger, but the Republican Party started to split. Right? The Republican Party had been this broad coalition of anti-slavery forces. Industrial capitalists who were anti-slavery, factory owners who were anti-slavery, but also small farmers who were anti-slavery, also the labor unions that were anti-slavery. The Marxists were part of the Republican Party, but a lot of the mainstream capitalists were part of the Republican Party too. It was a broad coalition. After the Civil War, the Republican Party split. The Republican Party increasingly became the party of industrial capitalists and imperialists. So the small farmers of the Republican Party, the labor unions, the progressive folks in the Republican Party broke away, and they formed the People's Party, or the Populist Party. And there was a split in the Republican Party. And the people that wanted to continue, that were more radical and progressive, they became the populists, and the mainstream Republican Party became just a mainstream party. And the populist movement, the small farmers, and they used to talk about how there's the producers of the nation and the consumers of the nation, and the monopolists and the producers. There's the farmers and the workers who produce the wealth of the nation, and then there's the monopolists who grift off the nation, the exploiting capitalists. And there was a big division. And among the populists, there was a huge amount of interest in socialism. Huge amount of interest in socialism. And in fact, there was what year was it? 1887, I believe? Yeah, 1887. The best-selling book in the United States was called Looking Backward, and it was written by Edward Bellamy. And it was the most popular book in the country, Looking Backward. And the book was it was about a guy who gets hypnotized and falls asleep, and he wakes up in a socialist paradise in the United States. He wakes up, and the USA has transformed into a socialist paradise. That's what it's about. And it's all about how the socialist paradise in the United States, how it works. It's a science fiction novel. It's kind of a love story. You can go read it. It's all on the internet. Go read Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy in 1888. It's a pretty good 1887. It's a really good novel. It's a socialist novel, and it was a best-selling book. And people were so inspired by the book Looking Backward that they formed nationalist clubs, they were called, to try and put Bellamy clubs or nationalist clubs to try and put into practice Edward Bellamy's socialist vision. And it was Edward Bellamy's cousin, Francis Bellamy, who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. Did you know that? Francis Bellamy, a socialist, wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. Right? A socialist wrote the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. Francis Bellamy was a Baptist minister who lived in Boston. He was a Baptist minister, and he was a radical. And from the pulpit, he gave sermons about class struggle and the working class rising up. So the city of Boston banned him from giving sermons within the city of Boston. So Edward Bellamy moved to Florida. He moved down south and went to Florida. And in Florida, he got arrested multiple times because he refused to segregate his congregation. He had black and white in the same church pews together. And because of that, he was considered, he was in violation of the Jim Crow laws of Florida, which was a southern state. Francis Bellamy was a radical. And the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance was based on the oath that former Confederates had to take. If you had been a Confederate, in order to get your voting rights back, in order to get your U.S. citizenship restored, because you had taken up arms against the U.S. government, in order to get your voting rights back, you had to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And think about those words, because the way we think about those words now and the way that those words were originally intended is quite different. The way, when I was in school, we'd have to say the Pledge of Allegiance, right? And the way those words were always interpreted is, that we have liberty and justice for all. This is the greatest country in the world, and if you don't like it here, you should move to another country because we have liberty and justice for all. We're one nation under God. Well, the under God part was added in the 1950s. That was added during the Red Scare, McCarthyism in the 1950s. On top of that, but let me also add to it that liberty and justice for all was meant to be an aspiration. It was not that it already had existed. It was an aspiration. And the phrase "one nation, indivisible" meant no slavery, right? One nation, like one country, indivisible. Meaning no separate, with liberty and justice for all, i.e. no slavery, right? And basically, in order to get your voting rights back, if you were a Confederate soldier, you had to swear that the USA was one nation. Black people were the same nation as you, right? Black people, immigrants, foreign-born folks, they were all one nation, one nationality. There was one nationality in the United States, right? One nation, indivisible, meaning no secession, and liberty and justice for all, meaning no slavery, right? And for a supporter of the Confederacy, basically, that was you denouncing the Confederacy, because the Confederacy did not believe we were one nation. They said black people are not human beings. They're not the same as us. They're a separate people, right? They're not part of the nation, right? That's what the Confederacy believed. They also believed the country was divisible, that they could divide from the country, and they did not believe in liberty and justice for all. They believed some people could be enslaved and some could not. So by taking the oath, which became the Pledge of Allegiance, you were basically saying, F the Confederacy. Everything the Confederacy stood for, slavery, the inferiority of some people, the division of the country, all of that was repudiated. The Pledge of Allegiance was a giant fuck you to the Confederacy. That's basically what it was. The Pledge of Allegiance started out as a giant, loud fuck you to the Confederacy, And it sounds very different if you listen to it that way. If you listen to the Pledge of Allegiance that way, it sounds completely different from the way I was brought up to hear it as this is the greatest country in the world. What? You don't support the war in Iraq? You're a traitor. That's not what it meant. It meant, fuck you, Confederates. This is one nation, indivisible. We got liberty and justice for all, so fuck you, Confederates. That's basically what the Pledge of Allegiance started out as. Okay? And that's an important, when you hear those words that way, and you understand it was written by a Baptist minister who was a socialist, who refused to preach to segregated congregations. When you hear it that way, it puts things in a completely different context. Right? The first, after the Workmen's Party, after the looking backward and the nationalist clubs, you had a guy named Daniel DeLeon. And Daniel DeLeon was a college professor in New York City from Columbia University, and he was a Marxist, and he was a follower of Karl Marx, and he was a college professor. He was a college professor, and Henry George was a progressive, like left-wing economist in the United States. Wasn't a socialist, but he was like a progressive. He wanted to nationalize all land in the United States, and basically make the government the single landowner, right? And you would tax land values, right? It's Henry George economics. Henry George ran for mayor of New York City on this platform of nationalizing all land, and it was a progressive, and he supported labor unions and such. So Karl Marx and Karl Marx's supporters endorsed Henry George, one big union, right? Endorsed Henry George, and Daniel DeLeon publicly supported Henry George and campaigned for Henry George. And so he was fired from Columbia University because he preached in support of Henry George. And after he was fired from Columbia University, Daniel DeLeon, the socialist leader of New York City, he started the Socialist Labor Party, it was called, the SLP, the Socialist Labor Party. And their symbol was an arm holding a hammer. And the Socialist Labor Party, it was considered to be, the first major Marxist party in the United States, right? Before that, you had the Workmen's Party, you had the New York City Communist Club, some other things, but none of those things were very big. But the Socialist Labor Party of Daniel DeLeon was a big group. It had many thousands of members, and Daniel DeLeon became kind of the prophet of Marxism in the United States. And he went around the country preaching Marxism. Daniel DeLeon, he very famously, he ran for president and ran for office over and over and over again, didn't win. And he became a socialist agitator who went around the country preaching socialism. Daniel DeLeon. And Daniel DeLeon, he made a huge contribution. And this is the thing. Historical figures can sometimes have nuance, okay? And this is the important thing. Daniel DeLeon was on the right side of history. He was going across the United States promoting socialism. He was going across the United States, promoting the labor movement and the right of people to join unions and socialism. But he was a little bit of an ultra-leftist. Right? His Marxism was so rigid, he was such a rigid follower of Marxism that he often alienated himself from the labor unions and from the progressive people. So while we can recognize that Daniel DeLeon was a good guy, right, we can also recognize his shortcomings. Daniel DeLeon, for example, at the time in the United States, there was a big movement against the monopolies, the trusts, right? These trusts, these big corporations that had all the power. There was a big movement against the trusts, right? And it was not a socialist movement. It was a lot of small business owners, small farmers, all kinds of people that were against the trusts and the big monopolies. Well, Daniel DeLeon, he said, he liked trusts and monopolies. Why? Because after the revolution, it'll be easier to seize them by the government. And so he was going around saying that trusts and big monopolies were a good thing. Well, you can imagine why that would confuse people. Right? That would certainly confuse people, wouldn't it? Right? If there's this big progressive movement against the big monopolies, and he's going around saying, no, we actually like big monopolies because after the revolution, we can nationalize them easier, right? Stuff like that. Daniel DeLeon, he was a founder of the Industrial Workers of the World, but they had a big fight, and he was eventually kicked out of the Industrial Workers of the World. Daniel DeLeon, at one point, he was arguing that labor unions were not the answer, only socialism was, and that workers should not join any union that has a contract, because if you join a union that has a contract, you're recognizing the capitalist's right to exploit you. And he was a little bit of an ultra-leftist, you could call him. He was a little bit of an ultra-leftist, but he made his contribution. Eugene Debs was originally part of the Daniel DeLeon Socialist Labor Party. Eventually he broke away and formed the Socialist Party of America. And after kind of the groundwork had been laid by the SLP and Daniel DeLeon, a less rigid, a little bit more broad coalition called the Socialist Party of America was formed. And it was Eugene Debs who was the leader of the Socialist Party. Eugene Debs had been the leader of the Railroad Workers Union, right? The railroad workers in the United States went on strike all across the United States. It was the biggest strike in U.S. history. There has never been a strike as big as the railroad strike that happened, I believe it was in the 1880s in the United States. It was a huge railroad strike. And Eugene Debs, the leader of the railroad strike, and it was all over the country, this huge railroad strike, he was put in prison for leading the strike. And while Eugene Debs was in prison, he read Karl Marx's writings. He read Capital, he read the Communist Manifesto, and Eugene Debs came out of prison as a socialist revolutionary. And he got himself a bright red train car. Then he went from town to town, from city to city, preaching socialism. And the speeches of Eugene Debs are some of the most exciting revolutionary agitation you could ever read. I mean, it's just beautiful stuff. Eugene Debs was an amazing socialist agitator, right? And went around the country in 1912. He ran for president and got almost 1 million votes for president, 900,000. And the electorate, the country was much smaller in terms of population than it is now. I mean, the person who won only got like 10 million votes. So the fact that he almost got 1 million votes was utterly amazing. And in order to take votes away from him, Teddy Roosevelt, they formed another third party called the Bull Moose Progressive Party. Eugene Debs had so much popular support that not only did they have a Democrat in the 1912 election, Woodrow Wilson, not only did they have a Republican in the election, but then to take votes away from Debs, they formed a fake pro-imperialist socialist party, socialist in quotes, it wasn't really socialist, a pro-imperialist racist party called the Bull Moose Progressive Party, headed by Teddy Roosevelt, and they took votes away from Debs. That's how determined they were to stop Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs was like a rock star of American socialism. Everywhere he went to speak, thousands of people would see him, and they would scream his name, and they would cry, and there was like this religious fervor for Eugene Debs. He was the rock star of American socialism, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people voted for him. I mean, it was 900,000 people voted for him ultimately. Almost 1 million people voted for him in the 1912 election, and he was a leader of a mass movement. And then World War I started. And when World War I started, Eugene Debs was against the war. And it was illegal to give an anti-war speech. So he went to Canton, Ohio, and he'd been warned. They said, if you give an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio, we will throw you in prison. He said, I don't care. And he gave a big, long anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio. And he was arrested, and he was put in prison for giving an anti-war speech. They charged him with sedition. They charged him under the Espionage Act. And he went to prison for a long time for giving an anti-war speech. And he was ultimately released from prison. And after he got out of prison, he died shortly afterwards. That's Eugene Debs, a great hero of American socialism, an agitator and a revolutionary, Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs was utterly amazing. Now, what's interesting is that during this period, the issue of racism was a big divide in the socialist movement because there were a lot of socialists who were openly racist, but there were also, a lot of socialists who were anti-racist. W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, the most widely respected African-American scholar at the time, was a member of the Socialist Party. He was the founder of the NAACP, and he was a big supporter of Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party. And eventually, before he died, he joined the Communist Party. And I could go on with all this history, but I'm just making the point. A number of African-American churches in the United States aligned with the Socialist Party. The AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, aligned with them. There was something called the African Blood Brotherhood, which was a group of black men who armed themselves and trained other black people in armed self-defense and how to fight the Ku Klux Klan. And they eventually merged into the Communist Party, and most of them were members of the Socialist Party. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was an African-American city. They called it Black Wall Street, and eventually it was bombed. There was a massacre there. And if you read the newspaper accounts of Tulsa, Oklahoma, what was going on there, the newspaper accounts accused the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, this black nationalist city built out in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they accused it of being a Bolshevik city, right? When World War I broke out, right, there was a rebellion in Oklahoma. There was a rebellion in Oklahoma. In the state of Oklahoma, there was a rebellion among the population called the Green Corn Rebellion. And it was people in Oklahoma, they didn't want to get drafted to fight in World War I. And it was called the Green Corn Rebellion because it was led by Native Americans. The white workers and the black workers and the Native American workers of Oklahoma didn't want to fight in a capitalist war. They didn't want to fight a rich man's war. So they took up arms, and the Green Corn Rebellion, look this up, the Green Corn Rebellion of Oklahoma happened. It was an uprising, thank you, Piano Man, an uprising of working people who didn't want to fight in the capitalist war, and the military was sent to Oklahoma to put down a rebellion led by socialists and revolutionaries in the state of Oklahoma, right? And in fact, Richard Wolff pointed out in one of his recent videos, what state in U.S. history had the most socialists at one time in its legislature, in its state government? What state was it? Oklahoma. Oklahoma was a stronghold of the Socialist Party and the industrial workers of the world and Marxism in Oklahoma and Kansas. Wrote it down. Kansas also was a stronghold of the Socialist Party, and that all throughout the United States, socialism was very popular, right? It was very, very popular. I mean, I can go up into the 1930s, and after World War I, you had the formation of the Communist Party and the Great Depression, but this idea that communism is un-American, that socialism and communism are un-American, that's not the way we do things here. I'm sorry, you're just wrong. Anyone who tells you that has no idea what they are talking about. Anyone who says socialism is against America, PragerU, all this stuff, they have no clue what they are talking about. May Day, May 1st, International Workers' Day, started in Chicago. In Chicago, right? It was around the struggle for the 8-hour workday. That's how the communist holiday of May Day was formed. The second communist holiday, International Women's Day, that started in New York City because of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And it was women workers fighting for the right of garment workers in New York City. So this idea that people have that somehow socialism is foreign to this country, socialism is inconsistent with the American view, this is wrong. This is deeply, deeply wrong. Socialism has always been part of the American spirit. It's only since the Cold War and McCarthyism that there has been this erasing of that from our consciousness. There's been this effort to wipe it out, and then there's been the new left, the fake left, the synthetic left has come along and said, that's right, we are anti-American, and they embraced it. But no, socialism has always been a part of the American people, always been a part of American history. Thank you, Gleb. It's always been in this country, right? Always has it been here, right? At the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Bukharin, the leader of the Bolshevik leader, and Trotsky were living here. They were living in New York City. And they were in exile in New York City. And then the Russian Revolution happens. They went home, right? So this idea that somehow Marxism and socialism is foreign to the United States is just completely wrong. It is absolutely, positively wrong. I mean, anyone who tells you that doesn't know what they're talking about, right? We, people been in the United States, we have socialism in our blood, socialism in our bloodstream, right? It is in our blood, and the class struggle in the United States, the working people demanding their rights, this is just as American as ever. And we are now entering a prolonged capitalist economic crisis, and once again, we are going to have to find the class struggle tradition. Class struggle is going to have to once again emerge, if we're going to get out of this crisis. And it is our job as we try to build a proletarian organization. We're not trying to build a lumpen counter gang for one section of the ruling class or another. We are trying to get out of the movement and get to the masses. We're trying to get average Americans to stand up and assert their rights against the big corporations and banks and monopolies, the imperialists. As we do that, we are going to have to draw from American history, and we're going to have to show people that we're not in this to destroy America. We are in this to save America, because only socialism can save America. Only socialism can save America. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. That is what we need, and that is my opening message to you today. So thank you very much, and I will now call you out as I see you, names and locations. Who's with us today? Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Don't forget to hit the like button, the subscribe button, the notifications bell. We want everyone here to be part of this conversation. Montreal, Chaya, James Graham, Boston, Joey from Belize, Dylan in Toledo, Ohio, Nassau County, Elias from Finland, Raphael in Brazil, Justin Woot in Beijing, China, Norway, Arctic Angel, Chapel, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Keel Jones, Cincinnati, Ohio, Jenny Lynn, very, very good. Arturo in Anchorage, Alaska, Zephyr from Eugene, Oregon, West Palm Beach, Detroit, Nene in Detroit, Ryan in Oakland, Woonsocket in Rhode Island. Wow, okay. Tamara and Dario from Brooklyn, welcome. Nevada, Northern Nevada, says Craig, West Palm Beach, Travis, right? Occupied DC says Max the Sax. Shout out to you, Max, good friend of the program. Detroit, Anthony, Vinicius from Brazil. Could you comment on Steven Donziger, who won a multi-billion-dollar judgment against Chevron in Ecuador? The company sued him in New York, and he's now under house arrest. I have never heard of that, David, but I'm writing it down. I have not heard of this. David, Ecuador, Chevron. I have not heard about that case. I'll have to look it up. Chevron. But I'm writing it down. Mo in Toronto, West Palm Beach, New York City metro area says mass casualty. Portland, Oregon, Mexico, Quebec, Los Angeles, West Palm Beach, Union County, New Jersey, Allende, Mexico, Billy Kane in Gateshead, England, Vicksburg, Mississippi, Raphael in Portugal, Baltimore, all right, West Palm Beach, Travis Wade, Munich, Germany, Tucker Marks in a moving car, all right. Missouri, Bendigo, Australia, Northern California, Puerto Rico, Antoine in France, North New Jersey here, Balthazar in Oakland, California, Mo in Pomona, California, Brian Holden in England, Mari in Simona, California, the Netherlands, Mohsin from Iran, Gray in Newark, New Jersey, Denver, Colorado, the planet Mars, says Sam Fisher. Welcome, Sam. I hope it's cool. I hope you're getting enough heat there out there on Mars. All right, Adelaide, Australia, Massachusetts, Birmingham, England, Portugal, Australia, Sam Fisher, Joey from McKees Rocks. Very good. Very good. Ramiro in East LA. Shout out to you, Ramiro, good friend of the program. Orlando in Wisconsin. Daniel in Happy Valley, Oregon. Sweden. Bay Area, Dylan Smal. Chicago, Sam Netton. Chevron should be called Chevrong, says David Fox. Very good point. Big super major. Andy Finaro in Maine. Very, very good. Washington State, USA. Cosmic Bread. There we go. Joey from McKees Rocks. St. George, Utah. Oxygen. Hello from Italy, says Filipino Maro. Very good. South Mississippi. Thank you. Thank you. Tunia Tahitian Fire. Thank you very much for the super chat. James from Pennsylvania is here. Very good. Daniel in Seattle. Julian in Sussex, UK. Santa Barbara, California. Leipzig, East Germany. Kendall in San Diego. Wow. Wow, folks. What an audience that we got here. So the way this works is the remainder of the show is me writing down your super chat questions. So keep the super chats rolling in. I will be on here until I have finished answering the super chats or I, pass out or have a heart attack or something like that. First question is updates on merch. People want merch to go with these broadcasts. My goodness, I need to just make some merch, don't I? I did it for like a little bit, but yeah, I really need to just go ahead and make some merch. People want merch. If the people want merch, then I shall provide it. That was the first super chat question I got. Next question was urban-rural divide. Well, I grew up in a rural area. I come from a little town in Ohio called Orrville. Orrville is where Smucker's Jelly comes from. It is a little tiny town in Ohio, very religious, very conservative, very Republican. I graduated from Orrville High School, class of 2006. There were 115 people in my graduating class. Not a very big town, a lot of farmers, a lot of dairy farmers, a lot of cornfields everywhere. That's where I come from. And, religion is a much bigger deal. At least it was when I was a kid. That was before the new atheist movement and stuff. But I think it's still a pretty big deal. Folks are conservative, there is a big gap in the United States between urban and rural folks. It's a completely different environment. I've noticed that Hillsdale College is now the big conservative YouTube channel all of a sudden. It's like the new PragerU is this Hillsdale College. And you watch the videos on the Hillsdale College YouTube channel, and they live in this alternate world. This isn't the conservatism that I grew up. It's like conservatism in the United States is now counterculture, right? The mainstream of the United States is moving much more in a liberal, woke direction, and the conservatives are kind of left behind. Best books. They're, on legacy of U.S. socialism, and they're kind of left behind, the conservatives in the United States. And they're pessimistic and they're looking to the past. I've noticed that Hillsdale College, there's a lot of videos on there about conservative stuff, and everyone's a communist. Everything's a communist. Everything's communist. Communists are bad. Communism. They're fighting a culture war, and they're fighting a culture war, and somehow the enemy is communism in the culture war. So that means that free market capitalism is good when a lot of the things they're mad about are rooted in free market capitalism. Look, I'm sorry, they're mad about pornography. Do you think communists are making all the porno websites? Do you think that, you know who it is? It's the Workers' World Party. That's who it is, The Workers' World Party and Bob Avakian, and they sit down there and they go, how can we corrupt the morals of Americans? I know, we shall make porno websites. Porno websites all over the internet. Yes, this will help our agenda of advancing the class struggle. This is the dumbest thing. They're on there and they're talking about porn. They don't like porn as conservatives. They think porn is bad, and it's communist. Porn is like the most capitalist thing on the internet, right? There is nothing more capitalist than pornography. But these people, it's just they have this mindset, well, communism is bad. So if something's bad, it's communist. It's like, and they're mad about deindustrialization. That's free trade. That's Adam Smith, you idiots. You're mad about deindustrialization. Oh, you know what? Our jobs are getting shipped overseas. That's globalism. It's communism. No, it's not communism. It's just infuriating to listen to these conservatives, because it's like they everything bad must somehow be communist, and the answer is always just privatize everything. And it's like you want to shake them and be like, come on, can you just break with neoliberalism for a minute? Can you just think beyond neoliberalism for like 2 seconds, man? 2 seconds. Can you just question the capitalism is great thing? Can you just question that possibility for China's investment in the global South, eventually ending U.S. dominance and sparking revolutionary movements? All right, China investment, revolutionary movements. And I think it's a generational thing. I think that things are generational. But at the end of the day, look. Socialism is going to be brought to the United States by people that are economically suffering. Okay? It's not going to be the woke Brooklyn hipster kids who are going to make socialism happen. Right? Socialism is going to be brought to the United States by people who are economically struggling. Low-income people, poor people. That's who's going to bring socialism into existence. So if you are really a socialist, right? Get past doing what's trendy in liberal circles. Get past that, right? And get to the masses. Out of the movement to the masses. Out of the movement to the masses, right? I know it's not trendy, and I know it's not easy. And these folks, ideologically, poor white people, right? People of color that are impoverished or working class tend to have more of an anti-establishment, anti-capitalist worldview, But poor white people are very, very, very reactionary in a lot of cases. Their viewpoint is just solidly neocon, but that doesn't mean we can't struggle with them. I mean, it's our job to try and change that. And there's going to be a generational trend. Honestly, it's going to be a generational shift, right? I don't think the Cold War generation is going to change, but as the country changes, look, they're already setting it up so that if you're anti-establishment, you have to be a Republican. That Democratic Party circles, you're not allowed to question anything the mainstream says. So we'll see how this pans out. But the rural-urban divide is going to be very important. But conservatism is being canceled right now. And because of that, something else is going to have to replace it. We're looking at how things develop. I mean, the toxic stuff on the Hillsdale College and PragerU YouTube channels, that stuff isn't going to solve the crisis. It's not going to solve the economic crisis. The woke kids, the rich Williamsburg woke kids who are, they're not going to solve the crisis either. Marxism is going to have to change and become a populist ideology like it was with Debs, like it was, before. The right is, is not going to be able to give voice to economic thinking. We have to change how we operate. Socialists, we have to get out of the movement and to the masses. Get out of the movement and to the masses. All righty. Okay, Lukashenko, Alexander Lukashenko. Well, Alexander Lukashenko was a communist leader in Belarus, in the Soviet Republic of Belarus. When the Soviet Union fell, he ran for office on a platform of stopping and holding off free market reforms, and he won. They called it the last Soviet Republic. They still call it that, the last Soviet Republic. Belarus has maintained a state-run economy. The means of production in Belarus have not been privatized. Lukashenko, he's quite conservative culturally. He's certainly said some things I don't agree with. I do not endorse his social views, but Belarus under Lukashenko's leadership has been spared from the shock therapy economics. They didn't have the nightmare of the 1990s in Belarus, right? They maintained, and there's a very good book, The Last Soviet Republic, that you can read about Lukashenko's Belarus and their economic successes. Hugo Chavez praised Lukashenko's Belarus. So there you go. All right. Now somebody asked about Weimar interleft sectarianism. So the Weimar Republic, before Hitler came in, all right, so what does Weimar even mean, right? That might be a foreign word to some people. That's okay. So, up until World War I, you had the German Kaiser. After World War I, the German government fell. There was a workers' uprising at the end of the war, and the workers' uprising was crushed and diverted, and eventually you got the Weimar Constitution. They wrote a new constitution for Germany, and in the 1920s, the German government was called the Weimar Republic, because it was in the city of Weimar, Germany, that they wrote the constitution. Weimar Germany in the 1920s was economically devastated, and the Communist Party of Germany was very, very popular, and the Social Democratic Party, the SDP of Germany, was also very, very popular, and there was the Christian Democratic Party, and eventually you had the emergence of the Nazi Party. And the Nazi Party, it started out as the German Workers' Party, and then Hitler took it over, and it was the German National Socialist Workers' Party, and they kind of, all the far-right parties in Germany kind of merged into them. So you had the Nazi Party that was the far right, you had the Christian Democratic Party that was the center-right, you had the Social Democratic Party, which was the center-left, and you had the Communist Party that was the far-left. That was the Weimar Republic in Germany, and that was the political spectrum. And there was a river of blood between the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party, because that uprising that brought down the Kaiser at the end of World War I, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were murdered by the German Social Democrats. So there was a river of blood between the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party, okay? And nobody talks about this, right? They make it sound like, oh, why couldn't the Communists and the Socialists of Germany just get along? Because they killed each other, because there was blood in the streets. And this is a common Trotskyite slur, right? Is that somehow it's Stalin's fault that Hitler took power because Stalin ordered the German Communist Party not to align with the German Social Democratic Party. And so it's all Stalin's fault. The Holocaust is all Stalin's fault. All of World War II is all Stalin's fault. Well, that is historical simplism for a number of reasons. First of all, the river of blood between the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party was not created by Stalin. It was created by the Social Democratic Party, who killed Rosa Luxemburg and killed Karl Liebknecht and massacred communists. Briefly, Bavaria, right, declared itself to be a Soviet government. Google the Bavarian Soviet Republic. The German province of Bavaria became a communist government briefly, right? The Bavarian Soviet Republic. And all over Germany, there were many people who wanted, after World War I, for Germany to go and become a full socialist country, and it didn't. And increasingly, as the 1920s went on, the Communist Party became the party of the unemployed, of the desperately poor people that were unemployed and starving. And the Social Democratic Party, they were the party that ran the labor unions, and they were the party of people who were employed, of factory workers, of industrial workers who still had jobs during the Depression. And as Marxists, we know that ideas don't determine reality. Reality is determined by ideas, right? That thought is inseparable from matter that thinks, right? The reason I think is because I have this material thing called a brain, right? That, ideas don't define reality. Because the Communist Party, people who still basis for the difference between the SDP and the Communist Party of Germany, right? The SDP became reformist because it represented workers who didn't want to shake the boat too much because they still had a job and there was a depression. And the Communist Party became the party of the most radical, unemployed people with nothing to lose but their chains because they were the desperately poor and hungry people. And, and that was the basis for the divide. The German Communist Party was the party of the desperately poor and unemployed, and the Social Democratic Party became the party of the trade union bureaucrats and of the industrial workers. And that was the basis for the divide, okay? And there were events like the Blute May or Bloody May where there was May of 1929, where there was a communist uprising in Berlin, and it was mainly socialist-aligned police and officials that put down the uprising and killed communists, and shot down communists in the streets. And, eventually the Nazi Party became, the mechanism through which the German Communist Party and the revolutionary German working class could be crushed. And fascism emerged as an attempt, and the communists did offer to have an alliance with the German Social Democratic Party, which the Social Democrats refused. And yes, they called the German Social Democrats social fascists. That is true. And that now, after World War II and all that, we know what fascism means. That's not a scientific term. I wouldn't use the word social fascist now because there was clearly a big difference between the German Social Democrats and the Nazi Party, right? The German Social Democrats You know, they didn't do anything on the scale of what the Nazis did. They didn't set up a fascist state. So the term social fascists that was used by the Communist International was not correct. It was a mistake. However, you know, as R. Palm Dutt, who is the author of this very, very good book called Fascism and Social Revolution, says, social democracy and fascism are a 1-2 punch by the bourgeoisie. Capitalism is in crisis. People are hungry in the streets and they're rebelling. The first punch from the capitalists is social democracy, right? Try to stabilize it, you know, pass a few reforms, but all in the name of anti-communism. If that doesn't work, the next punch is fascism, right? And that they have ultimately the same goal, which is to stabilize the capitalist crisis, you know, and they use the state to stabilize the capitalist economy. And they represent different factions. There's Bonapartism, right? I talked at the beginning of the opening about the 8th Brumaire. The Nazi Party built a lumpen army. That's who the brown shirts were. They were a lumpen army, an army of lumpen intellectuals and hungry people and thugs and criminals. They built this lumpen army called the brown shirts, the stormtroopers. And they went around beating people up, and they were just, you know, it was a lumpen army that they built. So there you go. I don't think we're in a Weimar period necessarily. I think that there are fights among the capitalists, and, certainly comparisons can be made, but you have to remember this, Weimar Germany, and this is a mistake. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that thinking that Weimar Germany is the analogy for everything, right? This has been a big part of the Democrats. This has been their strategy for years. Try to get everyone to think that we have to vote for the Democrats or else we're going to get Hitler, right? There have been capitalist crises in many, many countries that have led to all kinds of different things, right? I mean, there's left-wing Bonapartism, Roosevelt, there's Louis Bonaparte in France, there are right-wing military juntas, there's all kinds of different forms of Bonapartist capitalist rule, so everything's not Weimar Germany, right? Getting people to think that everything is Weimar Germany is part of a hustle that the Democrats have been running on the left, right? If you're a socialist, right, you have to vote for the Democrats, because if not, the Republicans will get in, and then we all go to concentration camps and die. Well, that's a hustle. That's a scam. That's a scam that the Democrats have been running on communists and leftists for years, right? And especially now, when we're in a period where the Democrats are more pro-imperialist than the Republicans in many ways. It's clear that a lot of what the Republicans do undermines the interests of imperialism, right? And they make this argument blatantly. The idea that we should all just be shills for the Democrats because, oh my God, Republicans are Nazis, that's a scam. Don't fall for it, right? I am not in favor of sectarianism, right? And I would never endorse the Republicans. I would never tell people to Lennon on the lumpen. I would never tell people that they need to vote for the Republicans or anything. But this idea that Republicans are all Nazis and so therefore we should all vote for the Democrats, I don't buy it. Don't buy it. How do you confront a racist? Well, what I've noticed is, like, when I've confronted people that are racist before, like, people that are racist don't like to acknowledge that they are racist. So the way you can confront a racist often is you ask them a question. You just ask them a question that forces them to acknowledge that they are being racist. And that makes them very uncomfortable and usually makes them very angry. But it's a way that you're not pointing at them and saying, you're racist, because then immediately everyone in the room goes, oh, he's one of those. You just ask a very pointed question. Just ask a very pointed question. That can be a way of doing it, right? If somebody, classic example, right? A store owner or restaurant owner is harassing, somebody who's black in a store, and they're not treating all the white people in the store that way. You just ask the store owner, why are you doing him? I did that, he did that, he did that. Why are you going after him? And that immediately they'll just go, but don't, ask a pointed question that forces them to acknowledge they're racist. In what ways, if any, does the United States Constitution need to be revised? Right? That's generally the way I've been most effective. There were times in my life where I shouted at people. I don't do that anymore because it's not very effective, right? But if you just ask a pointed question, often that can can be a game changer. Alrighty. One big union. For the whole world, no. I mean, I think the labor movement in the United States would definitely benefit from being unified into one federation. But one big union for the whole world, I don't think that would work. Countries need their self-determination. And yeah, the wobbly vision, the syndicalist vision of one big industrial union for the whole world, I don't think that's necessarily correct anymore, right? So there you go. All right. China sweatshops. Well, look, people in the chat answered that. China has done more to raise people out of poverty, to improve people's living conditions. But if you want to just repeat anti-China cliches, there you go. Alrighty. I haven't heard about this David fellow, or David asked me about this guy who fought against Chevron in Ecuador. I haven't followed that case, but I'm definitely going to look into it. Definitely going to look into it. Definitely going to look into it. Best books on the legacy of U.S. socialism. Best books on the legacy of U.S. socialism. Well, Labor's Untold Story is probably one of the best books that I've seen out there. Labor's Untold Story. Beautifully written book on the history of the American labor movement from a communist perspective. Beautiful book. I would recommend Labor's Untold Story. That's very good. I would also recommend The History of the Communist Party by William Z. Foster. That is also very good. What other books would I recommend? There's many very good books out there, on the history of the labor and communist movement in the United States. There's a lot of good biographies. The book Forging American Communism, The Life of William Z. Foster is a very detailed biography of William Z. Foster. That's an amazing book. I learned so much from it. What else? There's a lot of books published by the Communist Party that are very good. The international publishers, there's a very good book called Brother Bill McKay, and it's the story of it's a biography of the guy who unionized Ford Motor Company and built the UAW at Ford Motor Company. Brother Bill McKay. It's a great book. Go read Brother Bill McKay, an amazing Marxist-Leninist book, just a great book by Philip Banoski. That's very, very good. You're asking specifically, and History of the Three Internationals is very good, David. I do recommend it. But if you're asking specifically about the United States, I could keep naming them off. One book that I learned a lot from is called Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. And it is a history of the new communist movement, the Maoist communists in Detroit in the 1970s. And that's fascinating. You will learn a huge amount from that book. There's a very good book called Revolution in the Air by Max Elbaum. It's a history of the Maoist movement in the 1970s. There's a book called Heavy Radicals, which is a history of the Revolutionary Communist Party and their role that they played in the 1970s in the new communist movement. There's Threat of Greatest Magnitude, which is a history of FBI infiltration of communist groups. That's fascinating. I do recommend people read the Teamster series by Farrell Dobbs. Farrell Dobbs, he's a Trotskyite, but he was the leader of the Teamsters Union in Minneapolis during the 1930s. And he wrote this 4-part book series about the Teamsters Union and the role that they played in the class struggle in the 1930s. Teamster Rebellion, Teamster Politics, or was it Teamster Rebellion, Teamster Power, Teamster Politics, and Teamster Bureaucracy. It's a 4-part series on the history of the communist Trotskyites and their role in the Teamsters Union. That's a very good book that I would recommend. Good series I would recommend. Gus Hall wrote a very, very good book called Working Class USA, The Power and the Movement. It's a beautiful book where he talks about his experiences in the labor movement. I would strongly recommend that. William Z. Foster, anything by William Z. Foster I recommend. William Z. Foster was by far the greatest American communist. Conservatism ever regain power. All right, wrote it down. But Working Class USA. There's some amazing stuff, amazing stuff out there. So there you go. And the Communist Party, they had many good books that they published on the history of the movement that they published, throughout the years. So there you go. All right. Will China's investments lead to revolutionary movements? Well, look, Bolivarian socialism in Latin America would not be possible without China. But China didn't create it, right? China didn't go to the people in Venezuela and Bolivia and say, you ought to be communists. No, it wasn't like that, right? But by China investing in Bolivia and investing in Venezuela, they created an atmosphere in which the anti, what do you call it? The national bourgeoisie of Venezuela, was in a position to fight the imperialists, right? The contradiction between the national bourgeoisie and the comprador bourgeoisie of Venezuela, so in the developing world, right, and this is different than in Western countries, should the flag of the USA be preserved. In developing countries, you tend to have different factions among the bourgeoisie. You have one faction they call the comprador bourgeoisie that tends to work with the imperialists, right? They're like middlemen. Stalin. They're like middlemen. They work with the foreign capitalists. And then you have what are called the national bourgeoisie. And those are capitalists that are competing with the imperialists, right? Chinese investment tends to strengthen the national bourgeoisie of a country, right? If China invests in a country, it tends to lead to the national bourgeoisie of a developing country gaining more independence and strength. And that lays the basis then for there to be a fight among the bourgeoisie in that country between the comprador bourgeoisie that are collaborating with the imperialists and keeping the country poor, and the national bourgeoisie that want to increase their own profits by expanding the domestic economy. Okay, and that tends to happen with Chinese investment, and Bolivarianism largely is a result of that. Chinese investment enabled the national bourgeoisie of Bolivia to gain more strength and push back against the comprador bourgeoisie of Bolivia, and of course, in order to defeat the imperialist bourgeoisie, they had to bring the working class, and that created a moment where the working class was brought into politics. Right? Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was very much representing the national bourgeoisie of Venezuela. He said he was for neither capitalism nor socialism, just whatever was best for Venezuela. He entered the political process, and then, the working class had to be his foot soldiers, and pretty soon the working class had entered politics and was the dominant partner in the coalition, right? And that Chinese investment helps strengthen the national bourgeoisie of developing countries. For example, like if it weren't for Chinese investment in the Philippines, you never would have had Duterte. Right? Duterte is not a communist, not a socialist. He's a bourgeois nationalist of the Philippines. But Chinese investment in the Philippines enabled the national bourgeoisie to get enough strength that they could push back against the comprador bourgeoisie. Moon Jae-in in South Korea, right? Again, the Park government in South Korea, the daughter of the dictator Park, who was president, she was just a kiss up to the United States. Well, it was because of Chinese investment that the national bourgeoisie of South Korea, that wants to have a better relationship with the North, wants to have a better relationship with China, they gained enough strength, they were able to push the Park regime out, right? And so it's a process. China is not spreading communism all over the world. They are not doing that, right? They are not promoting communism. They're not the new Communist International. But just by giving countries an alternative to trade with, just by stimulating the domestic economies of countries they're trading with and developing, that lays the basis for opening the door to class struggle. And that's what happened. That's what happened in Venezuela and in Bolivia and places, Nicaragua, places like that, is that Chinese investment kind of lays the basis for opening the door to an anti-imperialist struggle, which then enables the working class, in some cases, to take the lead, which in Venezuela and Bolivia and Nicaragua, they have taken the lead. But in the Philippines, the working class has not taken the lead, right? The working class, has not been able to take the lead. Duterte is a bourgeois nationalist. In South Korea, the working class has not taken the lead. But it's a process, I guess. I hope that answers your question. It's a very good question. It's very well thought out. All righty. Next. What did Lenin say about the lumpen proletariat? I don't actually know. I have not actually read Lenin's writings on the lumpen proletariat. I have read Marx on the lumpen proletariat. I have not read Lenin on the lumpen proletariat. All right. Does the U.S. Constitution need to be revised in order to create socialism? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you would need many new constitutional amendments. You'd need to add an economic Bill of Rights. You would need to change some of the laws around property, and yes, there would be a lot of constitutional amendments that would be necessary, I think, to create socialism in the United States. And we may need a whole new constitution, right? The Constitution actually lays out the procedures for having a new constitutional convention and writing a whole new constitution, right? It's in the Constitution that you can have a new constitution. Nobody knows that. People don't realize that, but it's actually in the Constitution, the procedure for creating a new constitution. So it may be necessary to write a whole new constitution, right? A lot of socialist countries have done that. So I could see that being part of the peaceful transition, right? But yeah, there would definitely be a lot of amendments that were necessary and probably a whole new constitution. So there you go. Will conservatism ever regain power in the United States? Yes, it will. Okay, and I honestly lose a little bit of sleep over this right now. I mean, a lot of things are being brought to my attention, and there are some things, I don't want to get too specific about this, there are some things that are in the works now that, yes, cultural conservatism and social conservatism is going to gain the upper hand in the United States in the next decade, if trends continue as they appear. If they do polling among Zoomers, they do polling among younger people, and give it about a decade, we're going to see a rise of social conservatism. That's going to happen. Now, the question is, will social conservatism be linked with economic neoliberalism or not, right? Will the social conservatism that emerges, will it be blatantly anti-LGBT? But yes, we are going to see a resurgence of social conservatism. That's going to happen. It's already happening. It's already there beneath the surface. Give it a couple years. Social conservatism is going to get stronger and stronger in the United States. Social conservatism is the future. Wokeism is already starting to get old. Cancel culture is already starting to get old. And give it a decade, and we're going to see a resurgence of social conservatism. Look, I've seen it in my life. Do you know how many people I know who were very socially liberal? And, a lot of them, it's interesting, I mean, a lot of them, went into AA or went into drug and alcohol rehab and have come out socially conservative. And a lot of them are socialists. They never abandoned Marxism and all that. But so many of the people that are attracted to me, and I don't expose anyone's private business. This is people's private business. So I would never share people's private business. But so many of the people that are attracted to my message are people that have been in recovery, right? Because the drugs are a big part of social liberalism now. Using drugs, people promoting drugs, that's a big part of it. And, if you get into that drug scene, pretty soon, your body, you can't do that forever, right? It's not a lifestyle you can keep living. The lifestyle of a drug addict, right, is not a lifestyle you can just keep living. And eventually you're gonna rock bottom. And, a lot of the people who are attracted to my message are people that are in recovery, right? I mean, that social liberalism, right, just promoting just endless chaos, eventually it runs out. Eventually you want stability. I mean, your body, your mind, you can't, you're not gonna be able to live that way forever, right? And that's the whole thing. And this is what pisses me off, okay? This has always pissed me off, is that there's this condescending attitude you get from some people, right? There's this quote supposedly from Winston Churchill, which he didn't actually say, but it's always thrown at us as if he said it, which he didn't say it. If you're not a socialist when you're 20, you have no heart. But if you're not a capitalist by the time you're 30, you have no brain. And it's like socialism is just a phase. It's just a passing phase, right? Clearly you'll grow up and you'll see that clearly socialism could never work. This isn't true, okay? That's true for social liberalism to some degree. A lot of the aesthetics and emotions associated with social liberalism are very much teenage and adolescent feelings. But there's an interview, a debate. I will never forget this. There's a debate between Barry Goldwater, the big conservative in the early 60s, Barry Goldwater, right? Barry Goldwater and Norman Thomas, who is like the big Socialist Party leader in the 1920s and 30s, and Norman Thomas and Barry Goldwater are debating, and Norman Thomas was quite old at this point, and Barry Goldwater refers to Norman Thomas as a liberal. Goes back to Norman Thomas. He says, I am not a liberal. He said, you don't want to know what I think of that twist dance the kids are doing these days. And it's like, the twist, right? Come on, babe. It was very controversial. People thought the twist was not an appropriate dance for young people to be doing. Well, Norman Thomas also didn't like the twist. He didn't like the twist. He didn't approve of it. He was a socialist. In terms of, he thought that the means of production should be organized to serve the people. The banks, factories, and industries should be organized to serve public good. But that didn't translate to everyone should do the twist, right? And that social liberalism and socialism don't necessarily always walk hand in hand. I mean, I lean socially liberal for the most part. I'm for gay marriage, right? If people are trans, I have no problem with people being trans. I'm for the woman's right to an abortion. But I will work with people who don't agree with me on that. And I believe that class and economics is what it's about. It's about anti-imperialism and class struggle, But I tend to be, my positions are basically socially liberal. But, I tell people to listen to classical music every day before they go to sleep and every day before they wake up. And that's a socially conservative thing. And I really, this idea that we shouldn't listen to classical music because it's too white and European, I don't buy that, right? I don't buy that at all. I think classical music belongs to everyone. When I was every time I've been at the World Festival of Youth and Students, I've seen the North Koreans, the most radical anti-imperialist government, and they're playing Bach and Beethoven and Mozart on violins, and they play classical music in North Korea, in African countries that have had anti-imperialist revolutions, that they want their kids playing Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. I think it belongs to everybody. Green New Deal, people never mention the original deal was developed. All right, yeah, we'll talk about that. Green New Deal versus Old New Deal. And I'm not against classical music, and I think it's healthier for you than rock music. I think rock music has some problems with it. It's very emotional. It makes you shake and all that. I do listen to rock music to get through the day, but I recognize rock music it's a little bit, you got to be careful with it, right? And that modern music, in a lot of ways, it's just pumping you full of emotion. It's hypnotic, and it's not necessarily good for you. That classical music stimulates the more rational side of your brain, the more mathematical and rational side of your brain, and that's a good thing. I don't use drugs, right? I never have used drugs, actually, and I don't even drink alcohol at this point. I'm not opposed to it. If you're a person who can drink responsibly, that's fine. But so in a lot of ways, it's weird that I can be somebody who's pro-LGBT, pro-trans, pro-gay marriage, pro-abortion, and still be a conservative because, and it's funny because even before I ever thought about this kind of thing, people would always tell me I was so conservative. It was actually very funny. People would always tell me that I was so wholesome and I was so conservative. And I'd be like, why? Why am I I never thought of myself as conservative. I thought of myself as radical left. But people would always say, you're just so conservative. And I'd be like, I am? But no, and I encourage people to exercise. I encourage people to keep their promises and keep their word. I encourage people to when they decide they're going to do something, follow through. Make a decision and have that level of self-control. If you decide I am going to do this, learn to have the willpower to actually make yourself do it. The worst kind of person, not the worst kind of person, but one of the worst personal attributes is when people make plans and do not actually carry them out, right? It's not a good thing to do. If you become the kind of person who makes plans they never intend to actually carry out, your self-esteem is going to decrease. That's a lack of willpower. Right? And you become a weak person. And ultimately, I do think that a lot of what we call social liberalism, well, I shouldn't even say that because it's like, again, I think there's any problem with LGBT, and I don't think there's any problem with abortion. And so, but a lot of things about our liberal culture, let me put it that way, are about weakening people, right? Weakening people, right? Drugs. Drugs is about weakening people, right? If you become no one is easier to control than an addict, right? If you are an addict, right? If you're an addict, the person who controls the flow of drugs into your hands has total power over you, right? And an addict is a very weak person. They have to get their hit, right? If they don't get it, they freak out. And you know, it's about weakening people, right? And that a lot of the mental health industry, I will say, and I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, I'm just telling you my perception, right? This is not a professional opinion. Do not, if you have a serious mental health concern, don't listen to me, listen to a professional. I'm just giving you my perspective, is that I feel like it used to be that the job of the mental health profession was to make you stronger. The idea was if someone's feeling depressed, if someone's feeling, unhealthy or whatever, they would go and they would go to a mental health professional, and the mental health professional would make them stronger, help them overcome this problem that was making it harder for them to live their life the way they wanted. Now it seems like the opposite. People go to mental health professionals, and the mental health professional said, they say, I have this problem. And the mental health professional says to them, wow, well, actually, you've got 10 or 20 more problems, and you need these pills to take, and you need to, see me. And that in a lot of cases, mental health has not become about making people better and making people stronger. It's about kind of giving permission for people to embrace their weakness, embrace their hardships, make their life more hard. And it's a bit of a problem, and that we get into this position where it's like on the internet and stuff, among internet leftists, Zoomers are increasingly left-wing and socially progressive. Zoomers increasingly left-wing. It's a problem, right? That maintaining discipline in your life, right? I exercise 5 times a week. I go to the gym 5 times a week, right? And I don't feel like it, The summertime, I get this feeling like, ugh, I don't want to go to the gym. Sometimes I'm very busy and I'm rushing there and rushing back because I got to do 10 other things. But I have made a decision to myself that I am going to the gym 5 times a week, and that's it. And by doing that, I feel powerful. I have decided I am going to go to the gym 5 times a week, and so I do it. And that gives you a sense of power. Do you know what I'm saying? It's hard to explain, but it's like by having the discipline to have your brain in control and not your body, right? To not be governed, to be able to make yourself do things, to have your mind make yourself do things your body doesn't want to do. That's power, right? If you really want to have power in the world,